December 4, 1991, Miami International Airport. Pan Am Flight 436 pushed back from the gate at Bridgetown, Barbados, carrying 102 passengers and a crew who understood the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just another flight to Miami. This was the last one, ever. The Boeing 727's engines spooled up. The pilots ran through their checklist one final time, and somewhere in that cockpit, beneath the professional routine of takeoff procedures and air traffic instructions, there had to be a moment of recognition. They were flying the funeral procession for American aviation royalty. When those wheels touched down in Miami, Pan American World Airways would cease to exist. The airline that had once carried presidents and movie stars across the globe, that had pioneered international air travel, that had shrunk the world and made distant continents feel reachable. It would all be over. 64 years of history, ending with a routine landing on a Thursday afternoon. But this story doesn't start with an ending. It starts with a vision so audacious that it seemed impossible. It starts with a young man who looked at an ocean and saw not a barrier, but an opportunity. It starts with the belief that the sky belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy few. This is the story of how America's greatest airline rose higher than anyone thought possible, and how it fell even harder. October 19, 1927. Key West, Florida. Juan Trippe stood on the dock, watching a hired Fairchild float plane bob in the water. 28 years old, Yale-educated, Wall Street trained, and absolutely convinced he was about to change the world. The float plane wasn't even his. He'd rented it for the day, but it was going to Havana, carrying mail and a handful of passengers willing to pay $50 for the privilege. $50. That's roughly $2,500 in today's money for a 90-mile hop over the Florida Straits. But Trippe didn't care about one flight to Cuba. He cared about what that flight represented. America's first scheduled international passenger service. His friends from Yale thought he'd lost his mind. You want to start an airline? During the Depression? Flying to Latin America? With what money? Trippe had convinced those same wealthy classmates to invest in his dream. The Aviation Corporation of the Americas would soon become Pan American Airways, and Juan Trippe, the son of a New York banker with a Venezuelan great-aunt's name, would become the most powerful figure in aviation history. Here's what made Trippe different from other airline pioneers. He didn't just want to fly. He wanted to dominate. He wanted routes no one else could touch, aircraft no one else could build, and a reach that circled the entire planet. He was a conquistador in a business suit, and his weapon was a mailbag full of government contracts. By 1928, Pan Am was flying throughout the Caribbean. By 1929, its route network stretched 12,000 miles through Central and South America. Trippe secured airmail contracts from the U.S. government by essentially becoming America's unofficial flag carrier. Washington wanted a reliable American presence in Latin America to counter European influence. Trippe delivered, and in return, he got something priceless: a monopoly on international routes. Other airlines could fight over domestic routes all they wanted. Trippe owned the world. In 1935, Pan Am did something that seemed impossible. They flew across the Pacific Ocean, not island hopping with small planes, but actual trans-Pacific passenger service using massive flying boats called clippers. The Martin M130 China Clipper carried passengers from San Francisco to Manila in stages, stopping at Hawaii, Midway, Wake Island, and Guam. The journey took 6 days. The fare was $950 one way, nearly $21,000 in today's money. Only the wealthy could afford it. But that was about to change. The 1930s and 1940s belonged to Pan Am's flying boats, luxurious aircraft that landed on water, because most of the places Trippe wanted to reach didn't have runways. These weren't cramped aluminum tubes. They were flying hotels, complete with sleeping berths, dining salons, and bars. Passengers dressed for dinner. The experience was closer to an ocean liner than a modern airplane. Charles Lindbergh himself worked as Trippe's technical advisor, surveying routes and securing landing rights. That's how seriously people took Pan Am. The most famous aviator in the world was helping chart their path across the globe. By 1941, Pan Am was flying to Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. 77 destinations across 3 continents. No other airline came close. During World War II, Pan Am's global network proved invaluable, transporting military personnel and equipment to every theater of war. The airline emerged from the conflict even stronger, with expanded facilities and government-subsidized infrastructure scattered around the world. But Juan Trippe had a problem. All those luxurious flying boats, all that first-class service, it was expensive. Profitable, yes, but limited. If aviation was going to truly connect the world, it needed to be affordable. It needed to be democratic. In 1945, Trippe did something revolutionary. He created tourist class. The airline industry hated the idea. International Air Transport Association members tried to block it. The British government literally banned Pan Am flights that offered economy tickets, forcing the airline to land in Shannon, Ireland, instead of London. The establishment viewed cheap air travel as vulgar, dangerous to the business model, a race to the bottom. Trippe saw it differently. He saw millions of ordinary Americans who'd never been able to afford international travel, suddenly boarding his planes. He saw immigrants visiting family back home. He saw honeymooners exploring Europe. He saw the future. He was right. By the early 1950s, tourist class was standard across the industry. Trippe had democratized the skies. October 26, 1958, Idlewild Airport, New York. The Boeing 707 sat on the tarmac, gleaming white with that distinctive blue Pan Am globe painted on its tail. Most airlines were still operating propeller-driven aircraft. They'd look at Trippe's jet order and shake their heads. Too risky, too expensive, too unproven. The British had already tried jets with the Comet, and those planes had literally fallen apart in mid-air, their fuselages ripping open from metal fatigue. Trippe ignored the doubters. In 1955, he'd ordered 20 707s from Boeing and 25 DC-8s from Douglas. Combined, the order was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a staggering financial commitment that forced Pan Am's competitors to follow suit or risk becoming obsolete. That October morning in 1958, Pan Am Flight 1 took off for Paris. The jet cut the transatlantic journey from 18 hours to just over 8. It flew at 35,000 feet, above the weather, above the turbulence that had made piston-engine flights so uncomfortable. And it carried twice as many passengers as the planes it replaced, which meant Trippe could sell tickets for less. The jet age had arrived, and Pan Am owned it. But Trippe wasn't finished. Jets were faster, but he wanted something bigger, much bigger. In 1965, he called his friend Bill Allen, president of Boeing, and asked for an airplane 2.5 times larger than the 707. Allen thought he was crazy. Who needs an airplane that seats 400 people? Trippe did. He envisioned an aircraft that would make mass international travel economically viable. An airplane so large and efficient that tickets to Europe would cost less than a good used car. Allen agreed to build it, betting Boeing's entire future on the project. The result was the Boeing 747, December 30th, 1969. The FAA certified the 747 for commercial service. 3 weeks later, on January 22, 1970, Pan Am Flight 1 left New York for London. Well, it was supposed to. The first aircraft scheduled for the inaugural flight had an overheating engine and had to be swapped out. After a 6-hour delay, a substitute 747 called Clipper Victor finally lifted off at 2 in the morning with 332 passengers aboard. The 747 was enormous, longer than the Wright brothers' entire first flight, wider than a 6-lane highway, with a tail as tall as a 6-story building. The upper deck, originally intended for a lounge, would eventually become business class seating. The main cabin could hold nearly 400 people in economy configuration. Airlines scrambled to accommodate the new giant. Airports had to widen taxiways and reinforce runways. Jetways needed to be taller. Everything about the aviation infrastructure had to scale up to match the 747's size, and it worked. The 747 became the most successful wide-body aircraft in history, the iconic Queen of the Skies. For Pan Am, it represented the culmination of Juan Trippe's vision: cheap, mass-market international travel. But there was a problem. Pan Am had ordered 25 747s in the initial purchase. They cost around $20 million each. That's roughly a $500 million investment in today's money, and it came at exactly the wrong time. By 1968, Trippe had stepped back from day-to-day management. The visionary who'd built Pan Am was no longer steering the ship, and the world was about to get much more complicated. October 1973. Oil fields across the Middle East. The Yom Kippur War had erupted between Israel and a coalition of Arab states. In response to American support for Israel, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo. Within months, the price of crude oil quadrupled from $3 a barrel to $12. Gasoline stations across America had lines stretching around the block. Drivers waited for hours to fill their tanks, watching prices climb multiple times in a single day. For Pan Am, the timing couldn't have been worse. The airline operated a fleet of fuel-hungry 747s designed for a world of cheap oil. Those massive jets burned through thousands of gallons per flight. When fuel prices quadrupled essentially overnight, Pan Am's operating costs exploded. The airline had bet everything on long-haul international service, the routes most affected by soaring fuel prices. Between 1970 and 1976, Pan Am lost $364 million. The airline's debt reached $1 billion. The glory years were over. Pan Am began selling assets just to survive. First went the Intercontinental Hotel chain, the hotels Trippe had built to accommodate Pan Am passengers. Then came the corporate headquarters, the iconic Pan Am building in Manhattan, sold for $400 million. Piece by piece, the empire was being dismantled to cover operating losses. But fuel prices weren't Pan Am's only problem. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act. For decades, the Civil Aeronautics Board had controlled which airlines could fly, which routes, and what they could charge. This regulatory system had protected Pan Am's international monopoly. Suddenly, that protection vanished. New airlines could enter the market. Existing carriers could expand into international routes, and everyone could compete on price. Startup airlines with lower costs and newer, more fuel-efficient aircraft began undercutting Pan Am's fares. Southwest Airlines pioneered the low-cost model domestically. Others copied it internationally. The era of cheap, no-frills air travel had arrived. But Pan Am wasn't built for it. The airline was designed for luxury, for service, for an experience that justified premium prices. Its cost structure reflected decades of operating as a protected monopoly. Its workforce was unionized, experienced, and expensive. Its fleet was aging. Its brand, while prestigious, couldn't compete with carriers offering the same destinations at substantially lower fares. Pan Am tried to adapt. In 1980, the airline purchased National Airlines for $437 million, attempting to build a domestic route network that could feed passengers to its international flights. This strategy made sense on paper. Other international carriers like United and American had extensive domestic networks that generated connecting traffic. Pan Am had been locked out of domestic routes for decades. Buying National seemed like the solution. It turned into a disaster. National's fleet didn't integrate well with Pan Am's aircraft. The corporate cultures clashed. Labor unions fought over seniority issues. And despite spending nearly $500 million, Pan Am never managed to build the kind of domestic network that could compete with established carriers. The acquisition added enormous debt without delivering the expected revenue. By the mid-1980s, Pan Am was hemorrhaging cash. The airline sold its Pacific division to United Airlines in 1985, giving away routes to Tokyo, Hong Kong, Sydney, and other key Asian destinations. These weren't minor routes. This was a quarter of Pan Am's entire network, some of the most profitable flying in the world. But Pan Am needed the money. The sale brought in $750 million, enough to stave off bankruptcy for a few more years. The airline also sold its London Heathrow routes to United in 1990, leaving Pan Am with only Gatwick service to London. Heathrow was arguably Pan Am's single most important European destination. Losing those slots was like a boxer giving up his best punch to pay training bills. Every asset sale bought time, but each one also made Pan Am weaker, less competitive, less able to generate the revenue needed to survive. The airline was eating itself to stay alive. December 21, 1988, London Heathrow Airport, Pan Am Flight 103 pushed back from the gate at 6:04 p.m. The Boeing 747, registration number N739PA, was scheduled for New York's JFK Airport with 259 people aboard, 243 passengers and 16 crew members. Among the passengers were 35 Syracuse University students returning home from a semester abroad in London and Florence. Christmas was 4 days away. The flight was routine. Heathrow to JFK, one of the busiest transatlantic routes in the world. The 747 climbed to 31,000 feet over the Scottish border. 38 minutes into the flight at 7:03 p.m., the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. Then it exploded. A small bomb hidden inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, tucked into a suitcase in the forward cargo hold, detonated. The blast created a 20-inch hole in the fuselage. At 31,000 feet, the pressure differential between the cabin and the outside air turned that hole into a death sentence. The aircraft's structure failed catastrophically. The nose section tore away. The rest of the plane broke into multiple pieces, raining debris across 845 square miles of Scottish countryside. All 259 people aboard died. 11 residents of Lockerbie, Scotland were killed when the main fuselage section crashed into their neighborhood, destroying an entire city block of homes. Total casualties, 270. The people of Lockerbie opened their homes to investigators and victims' families. They washed and ironed every piece of clothing recovered from the wreckage, so items could be returned to loved ones. Volunteers staffed canteens 24 hours a day, offering food and comfort to the responders combing the countryside for remains and evidence. The investigation became one of the largest criminal inquiries in history. More than 5,000 responders from the FBI and Scottish authorities searched the massive debris field. They recovered 319 tons of wreckage. Every piece was examined. Investigators found a tiny fragment of circuit board embedded in a piece of shirt. That fragment, barely larger than a fingernail, helped identify the bomb's timer. Further investigation traced it to Libya. In 1991, American and British authorities charged 2 Libyan intelligence operatives, Abdelbasit Ali al-Megrahi and Layman Khalifa Fhimah. Getting them to trial took years of diplomatic pressure and UN sanctions. Finally, in 1999, Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi agreed to hand over the suspects. The trial was held in 2000 at a specially built Scottish court on a former U.S. military base in the Netherlands. Scottish law applied on Dutch soil to satisfy both countries' legal systems. Fhimah was acquitted. Al-Megrahi was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 2009 on compassionate grounds, reportedly near death from cancer, but survived nearly 3 more years. Libya formally accepted responsibility for the bombing in 2003 and agreed to pay nearly $3 billion to victims' families. For Pan Am, Lockerbie was more than a tragedy. It was a death blow. The airline faced a $300 million lawsuit from victims' families. The Federal Aviation Administration imposed additional fines for 19 security failures. 2 warnings had been issued before the flight, one 16 days prior, another just days before, suggesting a potential attack on a Pan Am aircraft. Somehow, those warnings didn't reach the right people. The bomb got through security at Frankfurt Airport, where the luggage originated, and was transferred onto Flight 103 in London. Public confidence in Pan Am evaporated. Bookings plummeted. International travelers, particularly Americans, began choosing other airlines perceived as safer. Pan Am's brand had always been built on reliability and prestige. Lockerbie destroyed both. The financial impact was immediate and catastrophic. Pan Am was already struggling with debt, high operating costs, and intense competition. The airline didn't have the financial reserves to weather a crisis of this magnitude. Insurance covered some costs, but not the loss of revenue from passengers who stopped flying Pan Am. Not the damage to the airline's reputation. Not the psychological toll on employees who'd watched their company's name become associated with terrorism. January 8, 1991. Federal Bankruptcy Court. Pan Am filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The airline's debt exceeded $2 billion. Its assets were worth approximately the same amount on paper, but selling them in a distressed situation would bring far less. The bankruptcy filing wasn't a surprise. Industry analysts had been predicting it for months. Pan Am's plan was to restructure, shed unprofitable routes, reduce its workforce, and emerge as a smaller but viable airline focused on key markets. The airline would keep its East Coast shuttle service between New York, Boston, and Washington. It would maintain selective Latin American routes and transatlantic service to Europe. A leaner Pan Am could still compete, but 1991 wasn't finished with the airline industry. In August, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Within months, the United States and a coalition of allies launched Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait. The Gulf War sent oil prices soaring again, not to the levels of the 1973 crisis, but enough to severely impact airlines already operating on thin margins. Jet fuel costs spiked just as Pan Am was trying to execute its restructuring plan. Simultaneously, fear of terrorism reduced international travel demand. The Gulf War created concerns about potential terrorist attacks on American carriers. Many travelers postponed international trips or chose domestic vacations instead. Pan Am, with its focus on international routes, suffered disproportionately. Throughout 1991, Pan Am tried to find a buyer or a merger partner. Delta Airlines purchased Pan Am's Northeast shuttle service and most of its transatlantic routes for around $416 million. The sale was supposed to provide Pan Am with enough cash to continue operating a reduced network out of Miami. It didn't work. Pan Am's reorganization plan required precise revenue targets. Every month that fell short made investors and creditors more nervous. By November, it was clear the numbers weren't working. Pan Am was losing approximately $3 million per day. The airline couldn't make payroll. It couldn't pay for fuel. Vendors demanded cash up front. Aircraft lessors threatened to repossess planes. On December 3, 1991, Pan Am's creditors committee advised the bankruptcy court that the airline had no viable path forward. The next day, Pan Am announced it would cease all operations immediately. Flight 436 from Bridgetown to Miami became the final flight by coincidence, of schedule. It landed on December 4, 1991, at 2:38 p.m. The crew shut down the engines for the last time. Approximately 7,500 employees lost their jobs that afternoon. Many had worked for Pan Am their entire careers. They joined an airline that represented prestige, adventure, and American excellence. They left unemployed from a bankrupt company. Pan Am's assets were liquidated over the following months. The Pan Am trademark was sold at auction. Various companies have attempted to revive the brand over the years, starting new airlines with the Pan Am name. None succeeded. The original Pan American World Airways was gone. You could argue Pan Am died from 1,000 cuts, each one individually survivable but collectively fatal. The 1973 oil crisis, deregulation, poor acquisitions, asset sales that weakened the network, Lockerbie, the Gulf War, bad timing, bad luck. But here's the thing about luck, it tends to favor the prepared. Pan Am wasn't prepared. The airline had spent decades operating as a protected monopoly, its international routes guaranteed by the government, its competition limited by regulation. When that protection vanished in 1978, Pan Am didn't have the cost structure, the network, or the agility to compete in an open market. Look at the acquisition of national airlines. Pan Am paid nearly $500 million for a domestic carrier that didn't integrate well with its operations. The company needed a domestic feeder network, but it bought the wrong airline at the wrong price. United Airlines, by contrast, developed its domestic and international network organically over decades. So did American and Delta. When deregulation arrived, they were ready. Pan Am wasn't. The 747 order, visionary as it was, came with massive financial commitments just as the industry was entering a period of extreme volatility. Fuel prices quadrupled. Competition intensified. And Pan Am was stuck with a fleet of enormous, fuel-hungry jets designed for an era of cheap oil and protected routes. Could Pan Am have survived with better management? Possibly. Juan Trippe retired as president in 1968, though he remained on the board. The executives who followed him never matched his strategic vision or his ability to anticipate industry changes. They made defensive moves, selling assets, cutting routes, reducing staff, but never developed an offensive strategy for competing in the deregulated environment. Some argue Pan Am's fundamental business model was flawed after deregulation. The airline operated almost exclusively international routes without a domestic network to feed them. Every other major international carrier had both. Pan Am tried to fix this by buying national, but the acquisition was too little, too late, and poorly executed. Others point to Pan Am's cost structure. The airline had high labor costs reflecting decades of union contracts negotiated when Pan Am was profitable. Its maintenance facilities were scattered around the globe, expensive to operate. Its corporate culture emphasized service and prestige over efficiency. When discount carriers began competing on price, Pan Am couldn't match their fares without losing money on every ticket sold. The Lockerbie bombing accelerated Pan Am's demise, but the airline was already in critical condition. The tragedy destroyed what remained of Pan Am's reputation and triggered financial obligations the company couldn't meet. But even without Lockerbie, Pan Am's path was unsustainable. The airline was selling its most valuable assets to cover operating losses. Eventually, there would be nothing left to sell. Pan Am's final flight landed 34 years ago, but the airline's influence persists throughout aviation. The 747 revolutionized air travel. Yes, Boeing designed it, and multiple airlines operated it, but Pan Am made it possible. Juan Trippe's vision of mass-market international travel, his willingness to bet hundreds of millions of dollars on an unproven aircraft, his insistence that Boeing build something unprecedented. Without that, the 747 might never have existed. Tourist class, now called economy, was Trippe's idea. The concept that air travel should be accessible to ordinary people, not just the wealthy elite, came from Pan Am. Every budget airline today, every discount fare, every crowded economy cabin, that's Trippe's legacy, democratizing the skies. Pan Am pioneered computerized reservation systems, standardized training for pilots and mechanics, and coordinated airport infrastructure around the world. The airline helped establish air traffic control procedures, weather reporting standards, and safety protocols that became industry-wide practices. Pan Am's logo, the blue globe, became one of the most recognized symbols in the world. Second only to Coca-Cola in global trademark awareness at the time of the airline's closure. That logo appeared in over 300 films. It represented adventure, sophistication, American power, and reach. The company's collapse taught the industry harsh lessons about the dangers of complacency, the importance of adapting to changing market conditions, and the reality that brand prestige alone can't sustain a business with fundamental structural problems. Pan Am thought it was too important to fail. It wasn't. Modern airlines study Pan Am's mistakes. They diversify their route networks. They maintain domestic and international service. They focus ruthlessly on cost control. They avoid making massive capital commitments during industry volatility. They prepare for external shocks, terrorism, oil prices, economic recessions, because Pan Am demonstrated what happens when you can't weather the storm. For those who worked at Pan Am, for those who flew on Pan Am, the airline represents something more than business school case studies about bankruptcy. It represents an era when air travel felt special, when getting on an airplane was an event worth dressing up for, when flight attendants were worldly and glamorous, when the journey itself was part of the adventure. That world is gone. Low-cost carriers and ultra-long-haul flights in cramped seats replaced it. Air travel became cheaper, more accessible, more democratic. Exactly what Juan Trippe wanted, but it lost the romance along the way. Syracuse University maintains the Pan Am Flight 103 archives, keeping alive the memory of the 35 students lost over Lockerbie along with the other 235 victims. Every year, the university awards 35 remembrance scholarships, ensuring that the names and dreams of those students aren't forgotten. Conclusion. The end of the Golden Age. There's a certain poetry in how Pan Am's story ended. The airline that pioneered international air travel, that shrunk the world and made continents accessible, ultimately fell victim to the very competition and market forces it helped create. Juan Trippe built an empire on the belief that air travel should connect humanity, that the sky belonged to everyone. His vision succeeded beyond what anyone in 1927 could have imagined. Today, millions of people fly internationally every year. Tickets to Europe cost a few $100s. The exotic destinations Pan Am once served with flying boats are now routine vacation spots. But Trippe's company didn't survive to see the full realization of his dream. Pan Am fell from the sky, not in a single catastrophic moment like Lockerbie, but in a slow, grinding descent, driven by oil shocks, terrorism, deregulation, and mismanagement. The golden age of aviation died with it. On December 4, 1991, when Flight 436 landed in Miami for the final time, it marked the end of an era that had begun 64 years earlier with a rented float plane flying to Havana. The airline that had carried presidents and diplomats, movie stars and honeymooners, businessmen and students, the airline that had been America's ambassador to the world, was gone. Today, you can still see Pan Am's influence everywhere you look in aviation. The wide body jets that cross oceans, the economy cabins packed with ordinary travelers, the global route networks operated by surviving carriers, the airport infrastructure designed to handle international traffic. That's all part of Pan Am's legacy. But the airline itself, the actual company that Juan Trippe built, and the blue globe that represented American power and progress, that exists only in memory now, in photographs and films, in the stories of former employees and passengers who remember when flying was glamorous, when Pan Am was the world's airline, when the impossible seemed routine. The last flight of Pan Am wasn't Flight 436 from Barbados to Miami. The last flight was the one Pan Am never got to take, the flight into a future where the airline adapted, survived, and continued connecting the world. That flight never departed. The engines shut down, and the most iconic airline in American history became, like so much else from the 20th century, a beautiful memory of something that once seemed permanent, but turned out to be as fragile as the aluminum skin of a 747 at 31,000 feet. The Golden Age ended. Pan Am fell from the sky, and the world kept flying, carrying Pan Am's legacy forward even as the airline itself faded into history.